Hello, I'm Robert M. Ellis, and this is the 8th of a series of talk-through videos about the different sections of my book Absolutization, which is the first in the Middle Way Philosophy series. So this isn't a substitute for reading the book, but it might provide a way in, allowing you to access the key ideas more easily. That's the idea of what I'm doing here. So, so far in the series, I've talked through 5 different areas of absolutization. So ways in which absolutization can be understood using systems, using early Buddhism, using embodiment, using philosophy to avoid metaphysics, and using psychology, avoiding inner conflict. So my aim in the earlier part of the book, Absolutization, is very much to identify what absolutization is, and allow people to see the links between what have traditionally been different perspectives to approach it from, to see, for example, how the psychology and the philosophy and the neuroscience link together and tend towards a single kind of explanation, I think a helpful kind of explanation for our major problem as human beings. So that was the first 5 sections of the book and the first 5 videos in this series. There was then a section which was bringing them together, talking about the unity of absolutizing phenomena, and then the last section, the final 4 sections of the book, are concerned with criteria for addressing absolutization. How do we respond if we've got all these different tendencies? For example, the way in which reinforcing feedback loops tend to be linked with conflicts between different views within or beyond us, which tend to be linked with metaphysical ways of conceptualizing them. You know, if we've got all these different interlocking ways of understanding absolutization, how do we respond to this phenomenon? Because it's obviously a major problem for human beings. I would say the major problem for human beings, the underlying problem. So in the last 4 sections of the book, I'm looking for 4 criteria which will address absolutization. And those 4 criteria, I argue, are the ones that we need in any adequate response to absolutization, and thus they delineate the middle way as I understand it. So they consist in, first of all, in practicality, which I discussed in the previous video, and the one I'm going to discuss now is universal aspiration. So this is section 8 of the book, criteria for response, universal aspiration. There are then 2 further criteria which I'll be addressing in separate videos, and those are judgment focus and error focus. Now, universal aspiration is, I think, a very important issue for understanding the middle way and differentiating it from traditional metaphysical ways of thinking, absolute ways of thinking on one hand, or modern reactions to those traditional ways of thinking on the other. For example, religious versus secular ways of thinking, typically. For some people, the whole idea of universality immediately evokes a dogmatic perspective, that if you think you know what's true for everybody for all time, then you must be caught up in this sort of rationalist enlightenment delusion, which we've now punctured. So that's one extreme of response to the idea of universality, that there can't be any universality. And the other, of course, is to, if you've gone through a rejection of universality on the grounds that it's not realistic, that it's purely dogmatic, then you can react to the opposite view, which is to simply assert your absolute perspective and to effectively ignore the objections. And that's what fundamentalists do, for example. And there can be fundamentalists in any ideology. There are religious fundamentalists, there are also political ones, and so on. And they all assert that they've got the absolute truth, and that's it. And so, and if there's an absolute truth, then it must be an absolute truth for everybody for all time. That's what an absolute truth looks like, if there was one. So the whole idea of universal aspiration is using the middle way to try and overcome that dynamic, that polarized dynamic. And in the first chapter of this section, I'm talking about the crucial distinction between top-down and bottom-up universality, which I think is required to avoid this polarized dynamic. So a lot of the problem with the way people have tended to think about universality is that they've tended to think about it as top-down. That is, that we have a set of conceptual beliefs about what is universally true, and when we're certain of those, then we simply apply those. We use deduction, in fact, so we deduce from our universal beliefs what must be the case for particular people. So if you know what the good is, for instance, for human beings in general, then you know what the good is for each individual, for you and me and people on the other side of the world and people in 1,000 years' time. It will be the case for all of them. Now, that obviously fails to recognise the limitations of our understanding and the limitations of our view as embodied human beings. We can't possibly reach that kind of universal perspective, but I also argue that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try, and it doesn't mean we shouldn't have an aspiration to move towards a universal perspective. And I think we can see that aspiration at work in the best practice in science. So science illustrates the alternative to top-down universality, which is bottom-up universality. So in science, at its best, as it theoretically at least ought to work, you have the provisional development of theories, and then you test out those theories in relation to experience. And if your evidence or your experience is inconsistent with the theory, then you change or even abandon the theory. So your universal beliefs, you have universal beliefs, you dare to try and formulate universal beliefs. In fact, you need to, in order to test them in the first place. But at the same time, you're willing to change and modify those beliefs as you go on, to note the exceptions, to recognise the difficulties, and so on. So that general approach is well established in science at its best. Doesn't mean scientists always do it, but it's pretty well established as an idea that scientists will at least probably aspire to. But it's not nearly so well established in ethics, for instance, and I think it applies just as much to ethics. Bottom-up universality applies provisional generalizations, and those generalizations have to be meaningful to us, and for those generalizations to be meaningful to us, they have to be universal. We have to understand them, they have to be recognized in some way. But we have to hold that recognition of the possibility of a universal understanding with our lack of justification for absolute universal beliefs. So another way of putting that is that skepticism, that is the basis of human uncertainty, continues to apply at the same time as we continue to investigate generalized universal questions. And furthermore, that it's actually important for us to carry on doing that. It's important for us to aspire to get beyond the limitations of our starting point. To understand, if you're engaged in a scientific survey of trees, for example, then you want to understand how trees work. You want to engage in biological experiment and observation in ways that will apply to every tree. There will also be questions about exceptional trees, things that are on the borders of categorization of trees, and then there's lots of questions about higher level categories, plants, lower ones, specific kinds of tree, and so on. But you have to just keep working with these limitations to recognize that you can only gradually further justify your position. Obviously, as you go on, you become more confident in your position, and that's okay. That's also an embodied function of our operation. Now, so the second chapter of this section is called normativity, and that's concerned with the application of bottom-up universality to ethics, and also by implication to aesthetics, to any kind of normative judgment. So by normative, I mean a judgment about what we ought to do. In philosophy there's a distinction between normative and descriptive ethics, which is often made. So descriptive ethics is just when you're creating theories about what people believe about what they ought to do. So you can bracket all that, you can make it into another kind of scientific survey, which can be justified in terms of your observations of what people believe, or appear to believe, or even just how they behave. But normative ethics is a quite different case. So normative ethics is asking, what ought you to do really? What's when it comes down to it, what's the basis of your justification for acting in one way rather than another way? So why, for example, do you want to pursue a politics of justice rather than one of just tribal loyalty? Why do you care about human rights, say? So where's the ought in that? Okay. So obviously it's a complex question in any given case where we get that ought from. But in Western thought, what we have predominantly during the last 200-300 years particularly is this distinction between facts and values, between ought and is, which means that people tend, particularly intellectuals, tend to distinguish them absolutely, and to think of oughts or normative claims as being entirely different from descriptive or scientific or factual claims. And those are, well, if you make that distinction absolutely rather than provisionally, then you're not doing justice to the interdependence of those things in human experience, which you can see readily if you just think about the oughtness that accompanies any factual claim in practice. So why are you making that claim? What values does it express? What desires does it express for you? So I could say apparently neutrally, that Paris is the capital of France, but why am I saying that? Well, I'm saying that right now as an illustration, as an example, and I'm doing that because I think that will help my exposition of this particular issue on this video, and that's fueled by my values, by my desires for particular goals, which I believe are justified in important ways. So my assertion doesn't exist in an abstract vacuum here. It doesn't have a God's eye view attached to it, but the assumption about facts is that they're always abstractly justified simply by a reality which is connected to the words of the proposition, the factual proposition, which is never the case in our actual experience. So facts are always attached to values, and values are always attached to facts. So if I have a value claim to make about, say, abortion, which I might feel strongly about ethical arguments of abortion, then of course that depends on certain facts, doesn't it? Certain assumed facts about human gestation period, facts about conception, facts about the development of fetuses. Loads of facts are assumed there. Are those facts correct or not? Well, you can't make a judgment about those issues without connecting it with those supposed facts. So yeah, it's a nonsense to absolutely separate facts and values, and we have to address normativity if we want to have bottom-up universality, if we want to understand the world around us in an appropriate way and to make appropriate judgments which avoid absolutization. So yeah, if you think about the way in which we can treat normative claims in a bottom-up universal fashion, then I think it helps to think in terms of archetypes. So an archetype, as I've developed the idea, is an inspirational function. Yeah, so we have certain symbols and certain concepts which are meaningful to us in certain ways that have the function of inspiring us. And I would say good is one of those. So we need the idea of good, the idea of some things being better than others, the idea of a moral aspiration, of a normativity, for entirely practical reasons, to inspire us to behave in a way that's more adequate, to make more adequate judgments. So we can only do that if we apply bottom-up universality to normative claims as well as factual ones. So yeah, we can't jump to a perspective that is absolutely good, but we don't have to. We can maintain a concept or a symbol of what is good, and we can keep using that to inspire us, whilst at the same time working to improve our judgments about what is good in particular cases. So whenever we have a a practice of bottom-up universality. I think we need an idea of the top. We need the absolute perspective to be meaningful to us. At the same time as recognizing that we don't have it. And that's also connected closely to the idea of moral stretch, which is an idea that I'll develop more fully in a later book of this series, which is called Stretch Ethics. That will be volume 8 of the series. So the idea that ethics are based on stretch involves the idea that they start at a certain point, which is our factual point, if you like. It's where we begin. And we also hold a symbolic idea of where we're trying to get to. We hold those in tension and we stretch towards the further point, the ideal. And that's another way of thinking about the middle way. Quite a good way of thinking about the middle way, I think. That the middle way is a stretch from where we are to where we want to be, from the actual to the ideal as we understand it. And that stretch can only occur within a provisional space. It doesn't consist of some sort of absolute prescription of ethics. Okay, so I think that's what's required also for practicality. So we can only have a practical ethics if we have an ethics that starts with where we are, as well as works towards, has a meaningful idea of an infinite perspective. Okay, so that's the second chapter of this section of the book. The third one, 8c, is called systematicity, and that's concerned with the idea that bottom-up universality is also systemic thinking, or that systemic thinking also involves bottom-up universality. So systemic thinking needs to be carefully differentiated from systematic thinking. So often systematic just means linear and mechanical, but systemic means trying to think of things around us in terms of connections and relationships, rather than just in terms of things that we manipulate in particular ways. And in this chapter, actually, I analyse systematicity, this systemic way of thinking, in 4 ways, and contrast it with what I call normal practical thinking. So we do need to use linear thinking in a lot of our everyday operation. Otherwise, we won't be able to make our lunch. We wouldn't be able to do everyday things which require simple everyday practical thinking. But at the same time, we need to be able to move into systemic thinking for bigger issues. So normal practical thinking is either or. Involves there being discrete things with boundaries, whereas systemic thinking requires us to see those boundaries as fluid and changeable, to experiment with those boundaries and the perspectives that we use. So that's one distinction. The second is that normal practical thinking involves static categories, so we think we know what X, Y, and Z are and how they're different from each other. How grass is different from trees, and how there are different types of grass and different types of trees, and so on. But it's quite possible to completely reconsider all those boundaries that we take for granted, and to consider at the same time to reconsider categories, to reconsider our categorization of a particular thing. It all has to be contingent. We can't make it contingent all the time. This is completely unrealistic. But we can develop the capacity to move into a more contingent mode. Then thirdly, normal practical thinking involves linear causal relationships. So A causes B causes C. You hit one billiard ball with another billiard ball, and then the second billiard ball hits, moves, and maybe it goes down the hole in the corner of the billiard table. And that's sort of classic linear thinking. We want to reach our goals, and we do it by doing X, Y, and Z, and then we'll get what we want. But systemic thinking involves trying to come to grips with complex interrelationships and with the fact that we are usually unable to effectively analyze those complex interrelationships down to simple linear relationships. So when you interfere with an ecosystem, well, all sorts of things can happen. Some of them unexpected. So in a sense, you have to expect the unexpected. Yeah, that when, for example, in gardening, if you try to target a particular pest, actually you may make things worse because you starve the predators of the pest, say. Unexpected effects in a complex system. Then fourth one is that in normal practical thinking, we have a goal-oriented perspective which starts from where we are and what we want. But a systemic perspective tries to see that there are different goals and there are different perspectives as well. So we may change our perspective. We are fluid. We are varied. And there are also other people with other perspectives, just to make things even more complicated. And there are even perspectives that we don't even imagine or know about that are possible. The failure to think systemically is a major problem. Particularly, I discuss climate change as an obvious example at the moment, that you have to think a bit more systemically to understand what's going on with climate change, particularly the phenomenon of reinforcing feedback loops and how that may make things much, much worse. It's not just a question of more CO2, more global warming. It's a question of more CO2, which then gets into a reinforcing feedback loop in the system that already exists out there, which then makes the system geometrically worse for us. So it sets off on its own trajectory, independently then making things worse for us. So it compounds our own actions, and that's example of a system effect, a systemic effect, which we have to take into account. It's being forced on us by what's happening in the world. So we've got very little choice, I think, if we're going to be at all adequate in our response to things, to try and take that systemic approach. But a systemic approach is a very universal approach. It's trying to take the biggest possible view that we can take to be more and more adequate, and that's why it's very much associated with scientific perspectives, but perhaps the best and most imaginative scientific perspectives, not the most linear and narrowed scientific perspectives. And there's the idea also, which I mentioned, of soft systems methodology. So that's an attempt to apply the systemic perspective in particular contexts, such as a workplace conflict or something like that. So you could also see the middle way as a kind of soft systems methodology, if you like, if you find that helpful. So basically, by using a systemic perspective, we are also using bottom-up universality. So we're trying to gain a more universal perspective by moving beyond the limited categories, causal relationships, and so on that we might have assumed normally, or that we might fall back on for everyday practical purposes. So that systemic perspective is pretty much inseparable, I think, from the normative perspective. In order to be ethical, we also need to be systemic, which is totally opposite to a lot of the most traditional ways of thinking about ethics, which are incredibly linear. Okay, then the last 3 chapters of this section in the book look a bit more specifically at what universality might mean in 3 different dimensions. So, what is universality in terms of groups? What is universality in terms of space? And what is universality in terms of time? So, universality across groups, obviously there we're thinking about, well, what does it mean to try and take the perspective of the whole human race? How can we do that in an adequate way, rather than just assuming we know what's good for the whole human race, rather than just my group, whether that's people in my country, my class, my religion, whatever it is. So a lot of the I think less helpful ways of thinking about universality across groups try and identify, well, they have an idea of human nature, and they try and identify human nature, and particularly try and derive an ethics from that, and or maybe identify what all cultural groups have in common in terms of their ethical assumptions, and then create a natural ethics from it. I don't think that's a helpful way of proceeding. What we need to focus on instead is how humans work. What's the process that humans go through, and what does that have in common? How do we make judgments? And there I think there's a lot of commonality, there's a lot of evidence of commonality. Humans are subject to the same basic issues in the way that they make judgments, even though they start from very different places, whether that's in terms of their experience or in terms of their culture, in terms of the models they're using. So the brain hemispheres and the structure of the brain generally can really help. Human brains have the same basic structure. Obviously there's a few extreme examples of people who lack a certain part of the brain or whatever, but generally speaking, humans, for example, have 2 halves of their brain. It's not only humans, but most animals have those 2 halves of the brain as well. They've got the same basic dynamic. And the tendency for those 2 halves of the brain, left and right hemispheres, to specialise in different functions, and particular human problem of the over-predominance of the left hemisphere functions over the right, is again something that seems to be generally part of the human physiognomy, the human physiology. Again, that's always open to further investigation, but that's where the evidence seems to point to me. So that depends very little on your culture. Maybe variations, minor variations, maybe variations in culture, particularly between East and West, say. There may be variations in gender, and of course variations according to specialised training and so on. So yeah, of course we're all different, but we're not so implacably different that we can't develop bottom-up generalisations based on evidence about how we're similar, and work on the basis of those until we get better evidence to do something better. So there's a lot of scientific evidence, I think, that can help us to universalise across groups if we only focus on that as the basis of generalisation, rather than on top-down claims about human nature. Okay, and then there's universality across space. Now, that means if we're using bottom-up generalization or bottom-up universality, then we're trying to get beyond our identification with a limited space. You could call that parochialism, which literally means you're only concerned with what's happening in your parish, in your very limited area. A lot of our concerns and interests are parochial in the sense that, I mean, they may not be limited to such a small area as a parish, but they're limited to our country or a wider culture such as Western culture, for instance. So it's really worth making a bit more effort to stretch beyond those assumptions, the assumptions that we've been given, as it were, by a limited space, an identification with a limited space, which is often a geographical space, but obviously that extends also into sort of intellectual, cultural, conceptual space. And it's vital that we do that if we're going to address worldwide problems. So just in terms of the space of the Earth, that we think in whole Earth terms. So again, we do that more effectively with bottom-up universality, where we have provisional beliefs that we keep questioning, than would be the case with top-down universality, where we think we know to start with what is true across space in all places, in all cultures and so on. So yeah, the idea of a path, and the middle way is a path, is obviously a progression through space, but it also involves us as embodied creatures making that progression through space. So we start off in a particular place, the beginning of our path, and then we move on and we're in a slightly different place. Our space has changed, we have to adapt to our new position in space, and as we do so, we adapt who we are in relation to that new place in space. And that's what a path consists in, both metaphorically, literally and metaphorically. So yeah, a path is a spatial metaphor. We follow a path, and that path constantly involves the middle way in the sense of bottom-up adjustments to take into account new positions in space. So we can't look down at the whole of space from a God's eye view, but what we can do is move through space, and we can gradually adopt more adequate views according to our understanding of different places in space. Okay, and then the final chapter is about universality across time. And in some ways I think that's the most important one, because particularly the tendency for over-dominant left hemisphere perspectives to be blind to changes in time. So we tend to identify, for example, with what we feel at the moment or what we believe to be true at the moment. We don't tend to recognize how much we change over time. And that our perspective over time, even though it involves us over time, even though we're going to be concerned with what happens to us in the future, and we were concerned with what happens to us in the past, we still have this difficulty taking that into account when we make our judgments. We identify too much, quite often, with a specific time, which may be the present, maybe the past, maybe the future, an idea of the future. So there are all kinds of biases, which I discuss in a later book of the series, Bias in the Middle Way. There are all kinds of biases that involve getting stuck at a particular point in time and thinking that's the whole story. So for example, we can get stuck in the past. We can get stuck in the sunk costs fallacy, for example. So what we built up in the past, we don't want to let go of it, even if it's failing. We can get stuck in the present, even though that's not taking enough account of the past. So we're neglecting the past as the source of information, or we're neglecting considerations of the future because we discount the future. So this is actually a sort of institutionalized utilitarian habit, actually, to discount the future, to not pay enough attention to the future. And then we can also idealize the future. So neo-mania is a great example of people who get swept up with an idea of how things are going to be. Technical progress is one of those. Yeah. So we actually neglect our experience in the present, as well as making good use of information about the past. We can get stuck in so many ways, but the basic process involves not trying to adopt a bottom-up universality over time. So thinking that our present position in time is where it's at and is all we need to take into account. So bottom-up universality over time is vital. Obviously, we need to recognise, we are limited in our grasp of time, and it is difficult for me to really identify with the far future, certainly, just as it is to really make use of information from the past, dredging up my memories or even understanding history before my own existence. So universality across time is demanding, but again, it's worth stretching into it to make the best use we can of the information and indeed the values that we find beyond our own limited temporal perspective. So if we put all those together, so universality across groups, universality across space, universality across time, all of those together just give us different dimensions of a similar process. And they're all, so bottom-up approach to all of those has a crucial role in helping us to overcome absolutization. So absolutization involves us thinking we have the whole perspective, thinking we have the whole story, which of course involves us thinking or assuming that a top-down perspective is enough, that we've got a top-down perspective that's adequate. It involves us thinking that we got the facts and we can discount the values. It may involve us thinking that a linear perspective is enough, not stretching into a systemic one. It can lead to us thinking that our own group is enough, that perspectives of that group are sufficient, that our place in space is enough, that our identifications with our current time are enough, but they're not. We have to aspire to a universality beyond that if we are not going to get stuck in absolutization.